This is the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 lens for Fujifilm cameras. So what's interesting about this lens is that it fits into a gap in Fuji's prime lineup. The widest lens that they have, the widest prime that they have, is the 14mm, and that has a maximum aperture of f2.8. So if you want something really wide and really fast, you're limited to Fuji's 8-16 f2.8, which is a really big, heavy zoom, or looking at third-party lenses, which, and there's quite a lot of those around. There's the Laowa 9mm f2.8, which I've used quite a few times for astro, and there's a review on this channel. There's the Rokinon Samyang 12mm f2, I think, but this is faster than those. So it's not quite as wide. You lose a little bit in width because it's 13mm, but at f1.4, it is a fast lens. And from a landscape point of view, that makes it a very interesting lens for astro and aurora. So that's primarily what I'm looking at for a fast ultra-wide lens. Now, it's a question that I get asked a lot, which is the best option, the Laowa or the Rokinon? And so it's interesting to have this third option now. Now, I've been using this for about a month. I took it away with me to Lofton, where I used it as my regular wide-angle lens. And I also use it in Namibia for shooting astro. And what I'm really going to talk about in this review is what this lens is like from a practical point of view, from using it in the field. I'm not really interested in absolute sharpness, in measuring border sharpness at every single aperture. And that's not really what I do. What I'm concerned with is what is this lens like to use in landscapes? So shooting it for regular landscapes around f.71 or f.8, and what's it like as an astro lens, because that's primarily how I'm going to use it. Now, one of the first things that you notice when you get it out of the box is the build quality. It feels like a really well-made premium lens. Everything is metal. There's nothing plastic or flimsy about it. It's got a really nice weight and heft. Now, it is quite a heavy lens. It's quite a big lens. It's only a little bit smaller than the 10-24. It doesn't have anything like the flexibility of the zoom. And it's not particularly light either. So it's not a lightweight option, but it really does feel very well made. The rings are extremely good, particularly the aperture ring. It's got a nice click between each aperture as you move it through the aperture range. So there's no chance of accidentally nudging the aperture ring and changing the aperture. You can go all the way around to the auto aperture at the end. So it feels just like using a Fuji prime lens. It's got a really nice wide manual focus ring. Now that is easier to nudge. It's probably a little bit looser than I would like, but it hasn't really been that much of a problem. So it does feel very well made. And on the website, it doesn't say anything about weather sealing, so I'm going to assume that it's not weather sealed. But I have used this in quite varied weather conditions. It's had quite a few splashes from waves when I've been shooting coastal waterscapes in Lofton. It's been rained on in Lofton, and in Namibia it got a lot of dust blown at it. We were shooting in very windy, very dusty conditions in the desert, and it survived all that, and it feels great. Feels like new. The rings, all the rings still feel like they move very smoothly. Everything feels great. So it is a really nice lens. It is very well made. The front element is relatively flat, so it takes filters. I think the filter width is 67, so yeah, it's very easy to attach neutral density filters or polarizers or whatever you want. So it is a very useful, very practical landscape lens to use, and I used it a lot. I actually took this with me instead of the 10-24 and didn't really miss the 10-24 that much. This was capable in a lot of options, but I personally do find 13mm a little bit limiting. I would like something a little bit wider than that. There are quite often shoots when I felt that I wanted something a little bit wider. I think this is particularly important if you're shooting aurora or if you're shooting astro, where you're going to have a lot of sky in the frame. Usually you've got at least 2/3 of the frame sky, and you quite often want to have some kind of foreground to give the whole image some balance and harmony. So you might want a foreground element like a rock or whatever. And for that, I sometimes find myself wishing that I had something a little bit wider. Having said all that though, 13mm is a relatively useful focal length. It's nice for landscapes. It doesn't distort things too much. It doesn't make distant mountains too small. It's good for vlogging, so when you turn the camera around, it's wide enough to fit you all in, but not so wide that it distorts. And it's kind of a nice carry around lens as well. We walked around some villages and I just had this lens on. I found it a really nice focal lens to shoot with. Now, one of the advantages of this lens over the manual focus lens of the Laowa or the manual focus Rokinon is that this actually has autofocus, so you can connect it to your camera. It's got electronics in it, so you'll get all the feedback of what aperture you're at and things like that. And also it has autofocus if you don't like using manual focus. I found the autofocus to be really good, really effective, pretty snappy, on a par with something like the 10-24. I didn't really notice any lag, but as a landscape shooter, autofocus speed isn't something that I'm really particularly conscious of or worry too much about. But it is nice to actually have autofocus, because there are times when I've been using the Laowa before when I've kind of forgotten that it's just manual focus, and I've done a couple of shots before going, yep, I have to focus this, because it's not necessarily apparent on the LCD if you're a little bit out of focus. So autofocus is nice, and I think that goes a lot to explaining the price of this and how big and heavy it is. But obviously one of the most important factors about any lens is what's the image quality like. So I've been using this for about a month now, so let's have a look at some images I shot with it and some comparisons. All right, so let's have a look at just how sharp this lens is. So this first image is from Namibia. It's taken at f7.1 in the middle of the aperture range, and it's at 1.5 seconds, but the camera is on a tripod with a remote timer, so there won't be any nudging of the camera when I took the image. So if we just zoom in a little bit, you can see that it is a really nice sharp lens. The detail here is really nice. The detail in the rocks is excellent. And when we go into the fine detail at the grass in the bottom here, it's really nice. Let's have a look over in the borders and the corners. And it still feels really quite sharp over here in the bottom right corner. This grass looks really sharp. It's a little bit of softening there in the rocks. Let's have a look in the other corner. And again, quite a bit of detail here. Again, it's not performing as well in the borders as it is in the center. There's a little bit of softness there, but generally I would say that's quite acceptable. This is another image. This one's taken in Lofoten, again with the camera on a tripod, this time at f8. Right in the center of the image, you can see it is a really nice sharp lens. This is very nice. The detail here in these wooden trusses is really good. The buildings pop. There's a lot of nice contrast. Lots of it really does pop the lens. Looking at the detail in the cliff face at the back, it is really nice. We don't have any detail in the top there because it's just sky, but if we go down into the bottom corner here, we can see that, yeah, it does get a little bit softer in these rocks, but generally border performance is really relatively good. So I know a lot of people are going to want to use this lens for astro. So let's have a look at how it performs with astro. This is taken again with the camera on a tripod at f1.4, so it's wide open at ISO 2000. Now you can see the detail in this tree. It is very nice in the center. The stars do look very good, but as we get into the corner, we do start to get chroma. There's a little bit of, obviously there's a little bit of blur because it's a 10-second shutter speed, but it is very hard to get a shorter shutter speed than that when shooting astro, unless you're having a very high ISO, in which case you're going to get a lot more noise than you can see here. But generally there is a little bit of chroma, and you can see that it does start to get softer. The sharpness of the stars there in the corner is nowhere near as nice as it is in the center around here. Now we were light painting here, so I'm just going to look at this image basically because here the light painting hit the bottom of the tree, so it means that we can look at the corner and see how sharp the corner is at f1.4 with the lens wide open. And it's actually not that bad. I mean, you have to bear in mind this is ISO 3200, so there's going to be a little bit of softness there. But the detail down here in the corner, it isn't bad at all. But as again, if we get into the top, then you can see some chroma there, and it does quite significantly drop off in terms of sharpness. Now this is a comparison between the Viltrox over here on the left and the Fuji 10-24 on the right at the same settings. So you can see I've got the Fuji 13mm and then the same exposure settings, 1/80 and f7.1. One of the first things that I noticed is that the Fuji is actually a little bit brighter. It's about a third, maybe a third of a stop brighter, so it's getting in a little bit more light than the Viltrox. But let's have a look at the lens performance. So if we zoom in to 100%, you can see that in the center, they're both really quite sharp, and there's not really a huge amount of difference. But when we get up into the corners, so let's go up into the borders here, you can see that the 13, the Viltrox, is giving quite a bit sharper here around the railing and in the tiles. than the 1024 is. It's really quite a bit of difference here. There's quite a bit of softness in the borders. Let's have a look in the bottom corner, and again you can see that in the, I mean, this isn't quite so pronounced, but still the Viltrox is performing better. When we look into this bottom corner here, I think there's quite a bit of difference when we look at the number here, the 21, and the detail around the doors. The Viltrox is really quite a bit sharper in the borders. Now, I thought it might also be interesting to compare them at a slightly different aperture. The 1024 generally performs a little bit better, slightly more wide open, and that should also be the case with the Viltrox as well, because it has its whole aperture range is slightly wider. It's from f1.4 to f16, whereas the 1024 is from f4 to f22. So the Viltrox should also perform better, slightly further down the aperture scale. So here we are at f5, and you can see that the Viltrox is very sharp here. I mean, there's not a huge amount of difference in the center. Also, if we go down to the bottom, then we don't see a lot of difference here into the corners. Let's look at the top right corner. That's where the big difference was before. Now, the Viltrox is still performing slightly better here, but there's really not as much difference. The 1024 does perform a lot better at f5 than it does at f7.1. But I would still say that the Viltrox has a slight edge. It is slightly sharper. Let's look over here. And yeah, I mean, there's really not much difference, but just looking around the stone on these windows, I would say that the Viltrox is slightly sharper, but at this focal length, let's look at these numbers down here. Yes, it's a little bit more definition here on this number than there is on this number. So it's much closer, but I would say that the Viltrox is just a sharper lens pretty much all the way through the aperture range. And just let's have a quick look at the lens wide open. So this is at f1.4. So if we zoom in here, you can see that it does get the performance does fall off quite a bit when it is open really wide. It's quite soft in the corners there. It's still very sharp in the center, but this kind of fits with what I noticed when shooting astro with it. It's really nice and sharp in the center, but that performance does drop off quite a lot when we get into the borders. Now, in terms of flare, it performs just as well as most of the wide-angle lenses that I've used. When you've got the light source, like the sun here, right in the shot, then you can see that you do get quite a bit of flare, but it's not too bad. It's not really, really massive flare. But as soon as I move the camera over and get the lens flare out, just get the light source out of the side of the lens, then it does disappear. And this is without using a hood. I tend to not really use hoods with wide angle lenses, and I think that's actually really quite acceptable. One last thing that I noticed is that the lens does actually produce quite nice sun stars. You can see here, this is actually at f7.1. Usually I have to get a much smaller aperture than that to get a nice sun star, but you can see here, this is really quite nice. There's a little bit of flare, but for the most part, I thought that the performance of the sun stars is really quite good. Overall then, I've been really impressed with this lens. Its optical performance is really nice, both for astro and for shooting regular landscapes. It feels sharp from the centers right the way through to the corners, and it has a really nice build quality. It feels really solid, and it's a pleasure to use. So this has now become my go-to ultra-wide lens for any time that I need to be doing any astro work, anytime that I'm shooting anything like the Aurora. This is a lens that I'm going to have with me in my bag, and it will go with me on quite a few more landscape trips. It's a really excellent lens. Now, if you enjoy the videos and you enjoy my photography, I'd love to have you join me on a workshop. I've got workshops lined up in some incredible places. I'm going to be returning to Namibia, to Iceland, to Greenland, to the Dolomites. There's going to be some new trips coming up in places like Patagonia, possibly Kenya. So if you're interested in anything like that, check out my website. You can find full details of the workshops there, or drop me a line if there's anything that you're particularly interested in. And as ever, thanks so much for watching and supporting the channel. Good luck with all your photography, and take care. See ya.